In the fall of 1887, a young man from the Smithsonian sat down in a cabin in the mountains of western North Carolina, opened a notebook, and started writing down the names of people you can't see. His name was James Mooney. He was an ethnographer, sent by the Bureau of American Ethnology to live among the eastern Cherokee and record what the old people still remembered, before it was gone for good. He kept at it through the field seasons of the late 1880s, and years later the government printed what he had gathered. The book is called Myths of the Cherokee. It came out in 1900 as part of the 19th Annual Report of the Bureau of American Ethnology, under the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. You can still read every page of it today. I went and read it, all of it, and I want to be clear with you, from the first minute, about what this video is and what it's not. Everything you're about to hear is real, in the sense that matters most here. These are stories that real Cherokee people told to a real man with a notebook, more than 130 years ago, in their own mountains and in their own words. This is not a hoax, and it has nothing to do with aliens, or with anything somebody typed into a forum last year. He wrote down their names, and he wrote down who told him what. And what they told him was that the Blue Ridge, these worn green mountains that millions of people drive through every summer without a second thought, isn't empty. They said it's full of an invisible people who never die, people with towns under the high peaks and under the rivers. And they told Mooney about neighbors and friends and whole settlements who went in to live with them and never came back out. So here is what I'll do. I'm going to show you exactly what the Cherokee said was buried under these mountains, who said it, and the man who wrote it down. And every time we cross from something you could put your hand on, a real mountain, a real mound, a real book, into the legend itself, I'll stop and tell you, so you always know which is which. Because that line matters. It matters to the truth, and it matters to the people whose story this is. Let's go to the mountains. First, the man with the notebook, because he's the reason any of this survived. Mooney was born in 1861, and he spent years of his life living with the Cherokee in the Carolina mountains. In his own introduction, he says the material came, and I'm quoting him here, chiefly in successive field seasons from 1887 to 1890. He worked mostly on the Qualla Reservation in western North Carolina, and in the small settlements scattered between there and the Tennessee line. And he wrote one line in that introduction that I keep coming back to. "Mountaineers guard well the past," he wrote. In the secluded forests of Nantahala and Oconaluftee, far from the main road of modern progress, the Cherokee priest still treasures the legends and repeats the rituals handed down from his ancestors. That's who he was sitting with. These were the keepers of the old knowledge, the men the whole band relied on. And here is the part I want you to hold on to, because it's the whole foundation of this video. Mooney didn't invent these stories, and he didn't scrub the names off them. He tells you who talked, so let me introduce you to three of them. The first and most important was a man named Ayunini, whose English name was Swimmer. Mooney says nearly 3/4 of everything he collected came from this one man. Swimmer was born around 1835, just before the removal. He grew up trained to be a priest, a doctor, and a keeper of tradition, and he was recognized across the whole band as an authority. He spoke no English. He had served in the Civil War as a sergeant in a Cherokee Confederate company. Mooney loved him. When Swimmer died in March of 1899, Mooney wrote that with him perished half the tradition of a people. Read that again. One man dies, and half of what a whole nation remembered is gone with him. The second was old John Axe, whose Cherokee name was Itagunahi. He was born around the year 1800, which made him close to 100 years old when Mooney knew him, the oldest man in the band. Mooney says he cared most for the wonder stories, the giant, the great serpent, the invisible spirit people. And the third is the one I want you to remember most, because his fingerprints are all over the stories we're about to hear. His name was James D. Wofford. The Cherokee called him Worn-Out Blanket. He was of mixed blood, born back in 1806, and he could speak and write in both languages. On his mother's side, he was Cherokee, and Natchez, and white, and his mother was a cousin of Sequoyah, the man who gave the Cherokee a way to write their own language. Wofford had been a census taker in the 1820s, so he knew this country and its family lines better than almost anyone alive. He had helped lead one of the detachments on the Trail of Tears, and here is Mooney's own verdict on him, and I want you to hear it. Despite his education, Mooney wrote, he was a firm believer in the immortals, and several of the best legends connected with them came from him. Sit with that for a second. A man who could read and write in 2 languages, who had counted his own people for the government, who had walked the road west and survived it, still believed, to the end of a 90-year life, that these mountains were full of an undying people. He wasn't a child being told a bedtime story. He was one of the last men who carried the old knowledge, and he handed it to Mooney on purpose, so that it wouldn't die with him. Everything after this line is legend. What the tradition says next isn't something any census or any map can confirm. But it was told by these men, and written down by that one. And that's more than we can say for almost anything else this old. So who did the Cherokee say was living inside the Blue Ridge? They called them the Nanihi. Mooney gives you the translation directly. The word means, roughly, the people who live anywhere. But he says the Cherokee understood it to carry something heavier than that. It meant those who live forever, the immortals. Now I need to stop right here, and be careful, because this is exactly the place where people go wrong with this story. You will find videos and posts that take the Nanihi and turn them into aliens, or some hidden non-human race, or visitors from the stars. That isn't what the old people described, and it isn't what Mooney recorded. So let me tell you what they actually described. The Nunhi were spirit people who lived in the high country of the old Cherokee land. They were invisible, except when they wanted to be seen, and when they let themselves be seen, Mooney writes, they looked and spoke just like other Indians. Not little green men, people. A people who happened to be immortal, and, most of the time, unseen. In his notes, Mooney is careful about this. He calls them a kind of supernatural human being, entirely separate from ghosts, separate from the spirits of the animals and the plants, and separate from the great powers that ruled the sun and the rain and the thunder. They were their own kind, their own nation, if you like, living right alongside the Cherokee in the same mountains. They were, by every account, a friendly people. They loved music and dancing more than anything else. Hunters up in the peaks would hear it, the drum beating and the dance songs rising out of some townhouse they couldn't see. But when they walked toward the sound, it moved. It would slide behind them, or drift off somewhere else, so they could never find where the dance was. I love that detail, because it's so specific and so strange. Nobody invents something like that to frighten children. You only say it because it's genuinely what you believe happened to you up on the mountain. And they were kind to anyone who got lost. Over and over in Mooney's pages, the immortals find a wanderer who has lost the trail, take him into their townhouse under the mountain, feed him and let him rest, and then guide him home. In the Cherokee telling, they were about the best neighbors you could ask for. But where, exactly, did the Cherokee say these towns were? Here I want to bring you back down to solid ground for a minute, because Mooney didn't write down vague, floating legends. He wrote down addresses. The Cherokee said the immortals kept their biggest townhouses under the Bald Mountains. Now, if you've never been to the southern Appalachians, the Balds are a genuinely odd thing. They're high peaks, up near the top of the range, that have no trees on them at all. Grass and open sky, where every other mountain around them is thick forest. Nobody has ever fully explained why the Balds are bald. The Cherokee had an answer. The high peaks are bare, they said, because that's where the immortals keep their townhouses. On ground no timber will ever cover. And then Mooney names names. He says there were large townhouses of the immortals in Pilot Knob and under the old Niquossee Mound in North Carolina, and another under Blood Mountain at the head of the Nautilus River over in Georgia. I want to be honest with you about the geography, because the title of this video says the Blue Ridge, and the truth is a little richer than one single ridge. Blood Mountain sits dead in the Blue Ridge, one of the highest peaks in Georgia, and if you've hiked the Appalachian Trail, you've very likely stood on top of it. But the old Cherokee country spread across the whole knot of ranges here, the Blue Ridge and everything braided into it, the Nantahallas, the Unicoi, the Great Smokies. So when I say the Blue Ridge, I mean this whole world of mountains that the Cherokee called home. Real peaks. You could drive to every one of them this weekend. That's the part you can put your hand on. What they said was inside them is the legend. There was a spot on an upper branch of the Notley, running north off Blood Mountain, where there was a hole in the ground, like a small well or a chimney, and warm air came up out of it and heated everything around it. The people said this was because the immortals had a townhouse and a fire down under the mountain, and the warmth was leaking up out of the ground. Hunters in cold weather would stop there to warm themselves at the mouth of it, but Mooney says they were afraid to stay long. And then he adds this line, in that dry way of his. This was more than 60 years ago, he writes, but the hole is probably there yet. That's the seam of this whole story in a single sentence. A real hole, in real ground, that a real person could go and find. And an explanation for the warmth that belongs entirely to the world of the immortals. The Cherokee held both of those things in one hand at the same time. And honestly, so did Mooney. Now let me tell you the story he heard the most. This one came from Wofford, and Mooney says he had heard it so many times, from so many people, that he finally tracked down the man it happened to, and asked him to tell it himself. The man was from Notley Town. Mooney describes him as truthful and hard-headed, not a dreamer. And this is what he said happened when he was a boy, about 10 or 12 years old. He was playing down by the river one day, shooting at a mark with his bow, and when he got tired of that, he started building a little fish trap, piling up stones in the water in 2 long walls. While he was working, a man came and stood on the bank and asked him what he was doing. The boy told him, and the man said, "Well, that's hard work. You ought to rest a while. Come and take a walk up the river with me. Come to my house. I'll give you a good dinner, and I'll bring you home in the morning." So the boy went. They walked up the river to a house, and inside, the man's wife and the other people there were glad to see him, and gave him a fine dinner, and were kind to him. While they were eating, another man came in, someone the boy knew well, and spoke to him, so the boy felt completely at home. He played with the children there, slept the night, ate his breakfast, and in the morning the man walked him back. They went down a path with a cornfield on one side and a fenced peach orchard on the other, until they reached a trail, and the man pointed and said, "Go along this trail across the ridge, and it will bring you to the river road, and straight home. And I'll go back to the house." The boy started down the trail, and then he looked back. There was no cornfield now, no orchard, no fence, no house, nothing but trees on the side of the mountain. Somehow he wasn't frightened. He walked on until he came in sight of his own home, and there were a great many people standing around, and when they saw him, they came running and shouting, "Here he is! He isn't drowned, he isn't killed in the mountains." They had been hunting for him since noon the day before. And the boy was confused, because as far as he knew, he had only been gone one night. He said, "A man took me to his house, just over the ridge. I had dinner. I had a good time with the children. And Udsi Scala here," he said, naming the man he had seen come in at dinner. "Udsi Scala can tell you where I was." But Udsi Scala said, "I never saw you. I was out in my canoe all day yesterday, hunting for you. It was one of the Nunihi that made himself look like me." And then the boy's mother asked him, "You say you had dinner there?" And he said yes, and plenty of it. And she said, "There's no house there, only trees and rocks. But we hear a drum sometimes, in the big bald above. The people you saw were the immortals." I can't get past that story. And not because of the vanishing house, though that's the part everyone remembers. It's the dinner. The boy ate a full meal, played with real children, slept a whole night in a warm house, in a place his own mother says is nothing but trees and rocks. Time ran differently in there. He lost a day and a half, and thought he had lost an evening. It's a gentler and stranger thing than any monster story, and it's the sort of thing Wofford believed until he was 90 years old. And it wasn't the only sighting around Notley. Mooney records that once, 4 Nunihi women came to a dance in the town and danced half the night with the young men, and nobody realized they were anything but visitors from another settlement, until they got up to leave near midnight. Some of the men followed them at a distance to see which way they went, and watched them walk down the plain trail to the river ford, and vanish, right at the water, with no place anywhere to hide. One of the men who saw it was Wofford's own father-in-law, who Mooney notes was known for an honest man. Another time, a man named Burnt Tobacco was crossing a ridge and heard a drum and dancers off in the hills, and rode over to see who could possibly be dancing up there, and the sound slid around behind him, and he was so frightened that he rode as hard as he could all the way to the next town to tell it. He was a truthful man, Mooney writes, and they believed what he said. Look at what Mooney keeps doing there. He keeps telling you the witnesses were honest men. He records who believed these stories, and how much those people were trusted, and he leaves the believing to you. If you're new here and enjoying this kind of historical depth, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now I want to take you to the most famous of these places, because it's real, you can stand on it, and it's the beating heart of the whole legend. The Nikwasi Mound. This story Mooney got from Swimmer, the great keeper of tradition, and it reaches back long before Mooney, long before the removal, to a time the Cherokee remembered as ancient even then. A powerful tribe, one that Mooney says the Cherokee couldn't even name, an unknown enemy, invaded the country from the southeast. They destroyed settlements as they came, and no one could stand against them. They pushed up out of the lower country and into the mountains, until they reached the old town of Nikwasi, on the headwaters of the Little Tennessee. The Nikwasi warriors gathered their wives and children into the townhouse and kept watch. And one morning, just before dawn, the enemy came. The men of Nikwasi ran out to fight, and they lost. They were overpowered, and they began to fall back toward the townhouse. And that's the moment when a stranger appeared among them. He shouted to the chief to call off his men, and said that he himself would drive the enemy back. From the way he dressed and spoke, the Nikwasi people took him for a chief who had come with reinforcements from the Cherokee towns over in Tennessee. So they fell back, and as they came near the townhouse, they saw a great company of warriors pouring out of the side of the mound, as if through an open door. That was the moment they understood. Their rescuers were the Nenehi, the Immortals. And Mooney adds the one detail that makes the hair stand up. No one, he writes, had ever heard before that they lived under Nikwasi Mound. The Immortals came out by the hundreds, armed and painted for war. And here is the strange, specific thing. The moment they got outside the settlement, they became invisible. The enemy could see the arrow flying and feel the tomahawk land, but couldn't see who was throwing it. They tried to hide behind rocks and trees, and Mooney says the Immortals' arrows curved around the rocks and struck them from the other side. There was no cover anywhere on that ridge. The invaders broke and ran, and they were cut down the whole way, until at the head of the Tuckasegee, only a handful were left alive. Those last survivors sat down and cried out for mercy. And the Cherokee still call that place Deyulsunyi, which means where they cried. The Immortals' chief told them they had earned their punishment for attacking a peaceful people. And then, in the old custom, he spared the last few, so they could carry the news of the defeat home. Now, here is why this one lands so hard. Mooney didn't close the story off in the ancient past. He carried it right up into his own lifetime, because the Cherokee told him the Immortals never left Nikwasi, and to prove it, they pointed to the Civil War. Mooney sets it down plainly. In the last war, he says, a strong party of federal troops came to surprise a handful of Confederates posted at the mound, and they saw so many soldiers guarding the town that they got afraid and went away without ever making the attack. There were only a few men there. The Cherokee said the rest of the guard was the Immortals, still on watch under the mound. And the mound is real. I need you to hear me on this. The Nikwasi Mound still stands today, in the middle of the town of Franklin, North Carolina. Archaeologists think it was raised around 1,000 years ago. Mooney, writing in 1900, called it probably the largest mound in all of Western Carolina, and pointed out that it had never once been dug into. The Cherokee told him it was the home of the Immortals, and that a fire burns down inside it that never goes out. You can go and see it. It's right there, in the center of town, with traffic going by. And what they said is inside it, you can't check. That's the seam again. And by now, I think you can feel exactly where it runs. Everything up to here has been about the Immortals reaching out toward us. Now I have to tell you the part that turns this from a wonder story into something that genuinely aches. Because in the Cherokee tradition, the door swung both ways. Sometimes, whole towns of living people went in to join them, and Mooney set it down in a story he called The Removed Townhouses. He got the first version from old John Axe, the 100-year-old man, and a second one from a man they called Squirrel. Long ago, he begins, long before the Cherokee were driven from their homes in 1838, the people living along Valley River and the Hiwassee began to hear voices in the air. Invisible spirits, calling to them, warning them of wars and miseries that the future held in store, and inviting them to come and live with the immortals in their homes, under the mountains and under the waters. For days the voices hung in the air, and the people listened, until at last they heard the spirits tell them exactly what to do. "If you want to live with us," the voices said, "gather everyone into your townhouses and fast there for 7 days, and no one may raise a shout or a war whoop the entire time. Do that, and we'll come, and you'll see us, and we'll take you to live with us. I want you to hear the timing buried in that." This was long before 1838, long before the removal. The people were being warned that a stronger enemy was coming to take their country, which is precisely what happened, and they were being offered a way out, a way in under the mountains, into a world where no one dies and no enemy ever comes. So a town called Anaskayai decided to go. They gathered into their townhouse and prayed and fasted. 6 days passed, and on the morning of the 7th day there came a sound from the far mountains, and it grew louder and louder, until it was a roar of thunder all around the townhouse, and the ground shook underneath them. And at that, some of the people got frightened, and despite the warning, they screamed. The immortals had already lifted the entire townhouse, with its mound, up off the ground, to carry it away. When the people cried out, the immortals were startled, and they let a part of it drop. And that, Mooney says, is the mound of Saitsi, which you can still go and see. Then they steadied themselves and carried the rest of the townhouse, with all the people still inside it, to the top of a peak called Lone Peak, near the head of the Cheowa. And it's still up there, Mooney writes. Turned long ago into solid rock. But the people inside are invisible, and they are immortal. Another town, over on the Hiwassee, where Shooting Creek comes in, did the very same thing. They prayed and fasted the 7 days, and the immortals came and took them away. But this time not up into a peak, this time down, under the water, and they're there right now, Mooney writes. On a warm summer day, when the wind ripples the surface of the river, those who listen well can hear them talking below. When the Cherokee dragged that stretch of river for fish, the drag would always snag and catch on the bottom, even where the water ran deep, and the people knew it was being held by their own lost kinsmen, who didn't want to be forgotten. Who didn't want to be forgotten. And then Mooney writes the line that I think is the truest thing in this entire book, and it isn't even about magic. When the Cherokee were forcibly removed to the west, he says, one of the greatest regrets of the people along the Hiwassee and Valley Rivers was that they were compelled to leave behind, forever, their relatives who had gone to the immortals. Think about what that actually means. On the Trail of Tears, when soldiers marched the Cherokee out of these mountains at gunpoint, some of them weren't only grieving their homes and their dead, they were grieving family who, in their belief, were still here, still alive, still under the peaks and under the rivers, waiting. And the removal was tearing them away from those relatives as surely as from the living ones. You don't have to believe a word of the legend to feel the weight of that. It was real grief, in real people, on a real road west. There's one more of these, and it may be the strangest, because Mooney gives you the invitation almost word for word. It's the story of Canasta, a town that once stood on the French Broad River. One day, he writes, while people still lived at Canasta, 2 strangers walked into the settlement and made their way to the chief's house. They looked like perfectly ordinary Cherokee. The chief asked what town they came from, figuring they were from somewhere out west, and they said, "We're of your people, and our town is close by, but you've never seen it." And then they made their offer, and I want to read you the shape of it, because you can hear, right inside it, what these people were afraid of. "Here," the strangers said, "you have wars and sickness and enemies on every side, and after a while a stronger enemy will come and take your whole country from you. We're always happy. Come and live with us." And they pointed toward Pilot Knob. "There it is again. A stronger enemy is coming to take your country." This is a people telling stories in the shadow of the thing they can see coming. The offer the immortals make, every time, is peace. No war, no sickness, no enemy, no end to any of it. And it's being made to a people who were, in fact, about to lose everything they had. I don't think you can pull these legends apart from that history. The history is pressing down on them the entire time. The town of Canasta talked it over in council and decided to go. They packed up their belongings, fasted, and on the 7th morning a great company came for them, led by the 2 strangers, and set off together for the mountain. And when they reached it, the guides led them into a cave that opened, Mooney writes, like a great door in the side of the rock. Inside was an open country, a whole town, with houses standing in 2 long rows, the mountain people living in the houses on one side, and the other houses swept and made ready and waiting for the newcomers. And even after every last person from Canasta had moved in, there were still empty houses standing ready for whoever might come next. One man, who had only been visiting Canasta from another town, decided he wanted to go home first. The chief let him, and told him to tell his friends there was room for them too, if they wanted it. Then he led the man back out through the cave and left him on the mountainside. And when the man turned to look behind him, there was no cave, only solid rock. The people of Canasta were never seen again. And Mooney ends it as simply as you can. They're still living in Pilot Knob. There's a second Pilot Knob story about a poor hunter named Suwe Nahi who was taken in by the mountain people, and it holds one image I have to give you, because it's so human it hurts. At a dance inside the mountain, the hunter noticed one man who followed along at the end of the line. Not dancing, just calling out, over and over, a broken little sound. Coo, coo. And when he asked about it, they told him. This man was lost in the mountains. Once, he had wandered and called for his friends until his voice gave out, until all he could do was pant that one broken sound. And then we found him, they said, and we took him in. That's the immortals, in the Cherokee telling. They're the ones who go out and find the person who is lost, whose voice has already failed, and carry him in out of the cold. Now I have to clear up one confusion, because if you've heard anything about Cherokee legend, you've probably heard about the little people, and much of what gets said about them is simply wrong. The little people are real in the tradition, but they're a different people from the immortals, and Mooney is careful to keep the 2 apart. Their Cherokee name is the Yunwi Tsunsti, and where the Nunhi look and act like ordinary grown Cherokee, these ones are, in Mooney's own words, little fellows, hardly reaching up to a man's knee, but well-shaped and handsome, with long hair falling almost to the ground. They live in the rock caves along the mountainsides. They're great wonder workers, and, like the immortals, they love music, and they spend half their time drumming and dancing. And this is the part I want to nail all the way down, because it's where the honesty of this whole video lives. They're fairies, in the old, deep sense of that word. Small, hidden, powerful spirit folk of the woods and the rocks. They have nothing to do with aliens, or with some non-human species from off in the sky. They're the little spirit people of Cherokee tradition, described by Cherokee elders to a Smithsonian ethnographer more than a century ago, and written down in their own terms. Anyone who tells you the Cherokee were describing spacecraft or visitors from another planet isn't quoting the Cherokee. They're quoting themselves and putting their own words into a dead man's mouth. The record is right here, in print, and it says fairies, no larger than children. The little people were kind, especially to lost children, whom they would find in the mountains and bring safely home. But they had rules, and the rules had teeth. If you heard their drum in some lonely place, you didn't follow it, because they didn't like to be disturbed at home, and they would throw a spell over you so that you got lost and stayed dazed for the rest of your life. If they came in the night and did your work for you, cleared your field or gathered your corn, you didn't go out to watch them, because if you watched them, you died. And if you found something out in the woods, a knife, a trinket, you said out loud, "Little people, I want to take this, because it might be theirs." And if you took it without asking, they would throw stones at you the whole way home. Mooney records the darker stories too. A man sick with smallpox, just after the Civil War, wandered off, and his friends searched and couldn't find him. And weeks later he came back and said the little people had found him, and taken him into their cave and tended him until he was cured. And a man named Santawu, lost up in the winter mountains for 16 days, who came back and said they had kept him and fed him well, except that the bread kept shrinking in his hands, so that he could eat all day and never be satisfied. They brought him most of the way home, to a little creek only knee-deep, and told him to wade across. And when he had crossed and turned to look back, the little people were gone, and the creek behind him had become a deep river. He reached home with his legs frozen to the knees, and he lived only a few days. Even the kindness, you see, carried an edge. To the Cherokee, they were a real and serious part of the world, held in real care and real caution. So let me bring us back out of the mountain now, and back to what is actually still there. The balds are still up there, bare on top, for reasons nobody has ever fully explained. Blood Mountain is still there, in the Georgia Blue Ridge, with the Appalachian Trail running right over its shoulder. And the Niquosi Mound is still there, in the heart of Franklin, North Carolina. The mound the Cherokee believed was full of an immortal guard and a fire that never dies. In our own time, that mound was returned to the care of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, the descendants of the people who told these stories to Mooney. It's still theirs. It was always theirs. I told you at the start that I'd name the villain of this story, and I want to keep that promise, because it isn't who you might expect. There's no cover-up here. Nobody is hiding a city under the Grand Canyon. The enemy in this story is quieter than that, and worse. It is time, it is forgetting, it is the removal, which marched the keepers of these stories 1,000 miles away from the mountains the stories are made of. Swimmer died in 1899, and Mooney wrote that half the tradition of a people died with him. Wofford believed in the immortals, to the end of his 90 years. The only reason we have any of this is that a few old Cherokee men refused to let the knowledge die, and one outsider with a notebook sat with them in the forests of Nantahala and Oconaluftee, and wrote every word of it down before it was gone. Because in the end, what the Cherokee said was buried under the Blue Ridge wasn't gold, and it wasn't a machine, and it wasn't a secret that somebody is keeping from you. It was a people, an invisible, undying people, who loved music, who took in the lost and the freezing, who came pouring out of the mound at Niquosi when the town was about to fall. A people that some of the Cherokee, on the worst road of their lives, wept to leave behind, because they believed those relatives were still up there, still under the peaks, still under the rivers, still drumming in the high balds where no trees grow, and still holding the fish drag in the deep water, so that they would never be forgotten. Before we close, if these old stories and the people who first wrote them down are what you came for, the final boss tier at $9.99 gets you members-only videos plus your name in upcoming uploads. Boss tier at $4.99 for early access. Link in the description. Thanks for watching to the end. Mooney said an old verse at the front of his book, and I think it's the only honest way to end this one. I know not how the truth may be. I tell the tale as it was told to me.